Hello and welcome to Pictorial Planet. My name's John Finch. For the last couple of episodes we've been talking about fogging. We talked about chemical fogging and how to check for it, and we talked about safe light fogging. Both of these types of fogging are obviously detrimental to our image. They're going to spoil the image, and because of the way our eyes work, it's the highlights we're going to notice the most. But today we're going to talk about how fogging can be advantageous to our photograph. I've got a photograph that I need to fog. Let's take a look at it. And here it is. It's a beautiful building not far from where I live, and I photographed it before. On this particular occasion, the sun was just right. It was bouncing off this building toward the camera slightly, so I really got some beautiful contrast. But unfortunately, the shadows needed separation in order to get detail in them. So I needed a higher grade for the photograph to print. When I used the higher grade, I lost the detail in the highlights. And this is a problem you get. Let me just bring this closer to the camera. If you want to get your detail in dark shadows, sometimes you have to increase the grade. Now this is okay if you can dodge and burn that grade in, but in this case it was too difficult to burn in at a higher grade to get this separation. So what I've ended up doing is printing the whole photograph at grade 4. But because I've done that, I've lost the detail in my highlights. This is a problem with high grades. So how am I going to get those highlights back? Let's remind ourselves what happens if we deliberately fog the paper. And I'm going to call it flashing from now on, because when you deliberately fog the paper, it's called flashing the paper. So let's have a look at that curve again. Here is our paper curve. Down the bottom is exposure. As we increase exposure, we increase density on the paper. Now there's an area down here that we call the toe, and this is an area of what we might refer to as inertia, where we initially start to give exposure to the paper, but nothing can be seen at all. There's no change to the paper, and then at a certain point, and I'm going to mark it here just as an approximation, at a certain point we start to see the density appearing on the paper. So all of this exposure here was for naught because nothing appeared. Then the exposure increases and the density increases in a nice kind of even way. And then we reach this top area here, which is called the shoulder, where the shadows are on the paper, and it starts to level off. And when you get to this point around here, as we increase more and more exposure, nothing's going to happen. We've reached the black point basically, and there's no separation anymore in this bit here. So this is the two areas we have. So these are highlights, I'll write that high, and these are shadows, I'll write SH for shadows. Now in my case with this particular photograph, I have a problem, and that is I need separation in these shadows. They're blocking up. To get separation, I can use a higher grade. I'm using grade 4, and that gives me nice separation in this area here. For all intents and purposes, it sort of levels out this a little bit so that I get now separation in this area. That's great, but what happens when I'm using a higher grade is that I'm not getting any detail in my highlights. There's not enough of exposure to give me highlight detail. I need to somehow persuade the paper to start giving me highlight detail earlier on. Well, of course that's impossible here. I can't change this area. I've still got this place where this initial exposure will not give me any density. But what I can do is trick the paper, and this is called flashing. It's a deliberate fogging of the paper where I flash it up to this area here so that it's ready immediately to start showing detail in the highlights. I've kind of overcome this drag here, and I've set the paper at this level. As soon as it starts to get some exposure, it will start to give me highlight detail, and that's what I want to do with this photograph. So deliberate fogging is called flashing. I need to work out how to get to this place here where I can set the paper, and so I'm going to show you how we do that right now. I'm going to be using this thing here, which is a paper flasher. This particular paper flasher comes from RH Designs in England. It's a great little device. I attach this area that has the bulb in to the enlarger. I rack the enlarger up to a known height, and then I know roughly how much to flash the paper by. I always do a little test strip before I do it. You see, with this device I can switch it on and I can set the exact flash time, and what I usually do when I've got it connected to the enlarger is I set it to 1.5 seconds, and then I just press this button on the left hand side and it'll give me a flash of 1.5 seconds, and then I can do that again and again, and I can keep this nice flashing up and do a test strip of the flashing. Now I'll just show you how I connect it to the enlarger, so that if you ever do buy anything like this, you'll know how to connect it, or at least how I do it. So here is my little red safety filter that's on the bottom of my enlarger, and I have a rubber band that I keep up here, and I just hook it up like that. But when I need to use the paper flasher, I just bring this rubber band down and I connect the flasher underneath like this, with obviously the light side down, and I just hook it underneath this rubber band. Move the rubber band along a little bit, there we go, and I just hook it like this, there. And then I'm able to rack the enlarger right up to the top, and I put it up to a height of 60 on this Magnifax. I'm not sure what exact height that is, but it doesn't matter. Just rack your enlarger up so it takes this flashing light higher up. This means you can use longer flash times, so you have more control over your flashing. Just rack it up and then utilize the paper flasher on your paper. I'm going to use it now to make a test strip, so let me demonstrate. Of course, we don't all have paper flashers, so how would I flash my paper without one? Well, it is straightforward. Rack your enlarger right up to the top and close your lens down to as small an aperture as it will give you. On this particular lens, I can get f/16. Make sure that I've opened up my negative carrier as much as possible and have no negative at all in the carrier. Now, with this light diminished as much as possible, I also add density with the Magnifax. There's a density adjustment, and others of you have told me you've got those as well, but it's not strictly necessary. With the enlarger racked right up to the top at the smallest aperture, I can then use a very small timing on my timer to do the same thing. So I can still use 1 second, 2 seconds or 3 seconds, very small amount of time in order to make my test strip. So that's how to do it without one of these paper flashers. Here is a test strip piece of paper in the safe light. As you can see, I've marked it with some marks at equal intervals along it that I'm going to use to shade the paper as I'd make the test strip. And this way I can see how many exposures it took to get to where I want to show you, where it starts to show on the paper. So let me put it down here. I'm going to just pop it underneath there to hold it, and I'm going to get myself my card. Remember to always use nice thick card when you're doing anything like this, because you don't want any light to get through it. Don't you do the mistake of picking up an old photograph and trying to use that to shade your paper, because some light will get through that. I've got my flasher here set to 1.5 seconds, so let's do our initial exposure. There we are, that was the first flash. So the next thing I'm going to do then is to just cover it up and give it another flash. And then cover up to the next mark, give it another flash. And so on. And I'm going to go down the paper, giving it these small flashes of light until I've got to the end. Let's get this developed and find out where I start to see density. I've developed and dried the paper, and I'm now having a look to see where I'm beginning to see density. And I think you can already see that. Density is beginning to start here. It's very faint, but you can just make it out, can't you? Just a little bit of density, and then the next one it's more and more and more. Now, this is the area I'm interested in, because I don't want to flash the paper until it starts to have density like this. I want it to be flashed just to this area here, because this is where on that curve it's just before exposure starts giving me density. So this area is that toe where the exposure is not showing at all, and then boom, we start to see density. So right here is where I want to set that thing, just before I start to see density on the paper. So that's 1.5, 3, 4.5 seconds. I will flash my whole sheet of paper for 4.5 seconds before I make the print. Let's try it. I want to add something quickly now. This must be dry. This is so faint, this density here, that if this test strip is wet, you might not see it. So there's a bit of dry down you need to take into account. So do dry your test strip before you make your decision of how much to flash the paper by. Here is the first print before I did any flashing of the paper, and I want to just show you the highlights. So the shadows are nice and separated. I'm using grade 4, but the highlights are just white, just straight white highlights. No detail whatsoever. Look at these doors as well, these wooden doors. There's a lot of kind of white out on it where you're not seeing any detail. Now let's look at the new print that I've done. Again, the shadows are lovely and nice and separated, which is what I wanted, grade 4. But now I'm beginning to see detail in this wall, which is lovely. It's bringing in detail. It's making it look real. And down here, you'll see the door looks much better. There's less of that kind of white out areas, that shiny white. And in fact, we're getting detail. Very nice in there. Here, we're getting detail coming in. It's lovely. And even the ground, which was kind of just white in these areas here, has now got detail in the ground. So by putting that little bit of flashlight onto the paper, that 4.5 seconds, I have moved the curve, the toe, into an area where immediately exposure starts to go onto the paper. Even at a high grade, I'm starting to get detail. And that is now making a much nicer, much more three-dimensional looking photograph. It's quite beautiful, and I'm very pleased. Well, there's an example of when we actually need to fog our paper. It's unusual, but it happens, and I needed to show you how to do that. I want to thank you all for watching. Please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel. And a big shout out to my patrons who bring you this channel every week. So thank you guys. Okay, well, I'll see you next week.